In the center of the city, a carriage seemed to be moving. The boy on board said that he could understand, and also didn't want to join Mom and Dad in Etiston for the speech. But was it wise to travel without such a soldier? Man then said that the event had tight security, so himself was enough. They would also still prioritize the comfort of the child, who was none other than Prince Curtis. It was all done because Princess Kathleen had made it very clear that she did not want to attract attention. Kathleen has grown into a beautiful girl who looks elegant and very quiet. She later spoke up and admitted that she had made it clear that she didn't want to come, but she was there instead. Prince Curtis praised Kathleen for being amazing enough to survive as part of the royal family for this long. Kathleen should be grateful to have him as a brother because otherwise, the girl would just lock herself in the library all day. Kathleen casually reminded Curtis that he was the one who forced Kathleen's daughter to leave just because his lady friend canceled the appointment at the last minute. Of course, Prince Curtis was very embarrassed after hearing his best friend's words, but regardless, he did have to leave Grotter even though he planned to ride him during the trip just to get Kathleen to agree. The other man then reminded him that the bond creature named Grotter was the size of a carriage, and it was also not to be ridden as it could be dangerous, considering it was a dangerous beast. However, Prince Curtis felt that Grotter had been getting better lately. Prince Curtis even asked his sister for her opinion. Kathleen did not respond as her eyes were fixed on Arthur in the distance. It made Curtis upset that he wasn't being listened to. Vincent felt panicked and confused about what to do. He had never seen Arthur this emotional before. If he did, those children might die. Vincent finally tried to stop Arthur. He told the boys to get out of there before anyone got seriously hurt. He also told Arthur to be patient because they were just kids. He asked Arthur to let go and make sure Elijah was okay. The boys laughed at Vincent for trying to protect Arthur, who looked embarrassed. Vincent was furious and called the boys arrogant and ungrateful in his heart, even though Vincent was trying to protect them. Arthur then called Vincent and asked him to step aside. The frightened Vincent could only apologize silently to the boys as it was now too late and hoped they could rest in peace. One bad boy came forward confidently to tackle Arthur. A girl hands him a stick and reminds him not to soil his clothes. The boy still thought fighting Arthur was easy. He started running while swinging the stick. He was sure that one blow would defeat Arthur, but Arthur easily hit him, knocking him to the ground. Meanwhile, the group of children was shocked. Another child felt that Arthur was being arrogant just because he met an opponent who had lowered his anticipation. He then ran to attack and made sure to show the difference between a villager and a real nobleman who had learned to use a sword. The boy started with quick movements. He deliberately amazed Arthur at the full power of the 1,000-step attack technique passed down from generation to generation in his family. The boy watched Arthur, who was also watching his movements, but he was sure that his 1,000-step attack technique was not something that could be avoided easily. He swung the weapon as a feint meant to attract Arthur's attention. He was sure Arthur would not be able to evade his attack later. However, to the boy's surprise, Arthur did not move from his position. Instead, Arthur moved and struck the boy on the back, knocking him to the ground. Arthur regretted that the stick was so fragile because it was not reinforced with mana. Arthur then left the broken stick behind. He felt he had to finish the game with his hands. Seeing this, Janiel thought Arthur was just an arrogant village boy. Janiel remembered how his father had explained to him that trident blows were far more dangerous than man-made weapons. Janiel dropped his staff. He was sure that with just one blow Arthur would realize his place in the world. However, Arthur casually walked over. Janiel began to feel a pressure on Arthur that even his father didn't have. But Janiel was desperate to strike in an attempt to throw a punch. Quickly, Arthur hit him in the face first, causing Janiel to fall to the ground hard. Janiel, who had opened his eyes, became furious and began to use his magic to attack. Janiel was furious that Arthur had dared to belittle the heir of the Trident family. Janiel deployed his heavy piercing trident on Arthur with full force. However, as Arthur turned his head, a wall of ice formed and blocked the boy's attack. Arthur and Elijah turned to the other side to see who did it, and it turned out to be Princess Kathleen. To Princess Kathleen, Arthur was just another boy, just like his boyish brother and his friends. At least that's what she thought during her brief encounter with Arthur. But on the birthday of the Hellsteve auction house, the princess's gaze always returned to him. Perhaps that was how Princess Kathleen learned that Arthur was not like the boys she disliked. The way Arthur dealt with problems made Princess Kathleen realize that Arthur was really different. The incident at the Hellsteve auction house back then was still very fresh in the princess's memory, because Arthur was there. Now, standing in Arthur's presence must have made her feel excited and thrilled, but she could always hide any expression on her face. Prince Curtis was the first to get angry and ask what this was all about. The mischievous boys were so startled by the presence of the prince and the princess that they immediately bowed down to pay their respects. Jamiel said nervously that he and his friends were just chatting when the barbarian villagers suddenly beat them up for no reason. Elijah was shocked to hear the boy's words and intended to refute the accusation. But Jamiel interrupted him by saying that they had been mistreated by the village children. Whereas the condition of the dwarf boy that Elijah was helping was not very good. The boy felt a very intense pain in his stomach. Princess Kathleen realized the boy's condition, explaining how it really happened. But Prince Curtis did not realize the truth before him. Instead, he asked angrily if it was true that Arthur had wronged the nobles. Princess Kathleen was very upset that her brother had believed the words of Jamiel and his friends. Arthur coldly replied that it was a great joke. Jamiel of Sapin country. The palace guard snapped at Arthur while grabbing his shoulder as he said, "How dare Arthur talk like that to the prince?" Arthur grabbed the grown man's hand to get rid of him, then apologized that his way of speaking tended to sound harsh when he heard nonsense. Arthur's piercing gaze at the palace guard gave the grown man goosebumps. He also wondered how a boy could grasp his hand so firmly as if ready to crush his arm. Vincent immediately released Arthur's grip on the soldier's hand while apologizing for them to forget about his nephew Arthur's behavior. Mr. Vincent explained that Arthur only wanted to say that Jamiel and his friends had lied. Prince Curtis knew Vincent, so he asked what Vincent was doing in that place. Vincent explained that they were on their way to the square, and as they passed this place, there was a group of children who were bullying the poor boy who was currently being helped by Elijah. Suddenly, the dwarf boy vomited enough blood to shock everyone. Prince Curtis turned, yelling at Jamiel and his friends because they dared to lie to the prince. Curtis asked what their names were. Jamiel stood up and introduced himself as the eldest son of the Trident family. Upon hearing the boy's surname, Prince Curtis realized the matter was getting complicated. Because Jamiel had made a big mistake by using deadly magic, but the Trident family was the main support for the royal family as well as the Cyrus Academy. No one knew how the Trident family would react if something happened to the heir. As the prince remained silent in the presence of the Trident family heir, Jamiel began to smile happily in silence. Only Princess Kathleen dared to point out Jamiel's faults and almost announced his punishment. But Prince Curtis swung an arm right in her sister's face to stop her from speaking. Prince Curtis just said that in the end no one was seriously hurt. So Prince Curtis hoped that everything was in place to end this on good terms. Jamiel was the one who felt the most victorious here. Jamiel knew that with so many father snags interfering in this kingdom, even the royal family wouldn't be able to touch him. In his heart, Jamiel smiled triumphantly. Until Arthur suddenly requested a two-way communication scroll from Vincent. Mr. Vincent immediately gave him the scroll, and Arthur immediately made a call to Mrs. Cynthia Goodsky. Jamiel still thinks Arthur is stupid because he dared to contact the director of Cyrus directly. At first, Mrs. Cynthia thought the person calling her was Vincent, so she said she didn't really appreciate the sudden call. But when she found out it was Arthur, her tone immediately changed. She said she was very happy to talk to Arthur. Mrs. Cynthia was very happy that Arthur had contacted her after such a long time. Of course, everyone in the place was very surprised to see the change in tone and the happy expression of the Cyrus director. Without further ado, Arthur immediately said that he wanted Mrs. Cynthia to expel a boy named Jamil Trident and a group of his friends from the Cyrus Academy, because Jamil had bullied other races and used deadly magic in the city. Jamil and his friends were shocked to hear Arthur dare to ask that directly to the director of the Cyrus Academy. Mrs. Cynthia was quite surprised by the request, especially when she heard that the name Arthur wanted was from the Trident family. Seeing Mrs. Cynthia's hesitation made Jamil happy. In his opinion, even if a country boy like Arthur was a little close to the director, there was no way that person would be on his side, considering how much the Trident family had given to Cyrus Academy. Jamil was really happy thinking about this. But Arthur said that was if Madame Cynthia wanted to avoid Cyrus Academy. Madame Cynthia was faced with the choice of keeping the noble son who had donated so much to the academy, or Arthur, the superior future hero. Of course, the intelligent Madame Cynthia wouldn't keep some dregs with a bag of gold compared to Arthur. So without a second thought, Madame Cynthia immediately expelled them in favor of her future golden student. Madame Cynthia's decision successfully left everyone in open-mouthed shock. It wasn't long before the medics arrived to bring the injured children. So did their parents. Only Jamil's parents could not immediately come to pick him up. But Jamil's mother contacted him through the communication scroll and immediately yelled at her son because she got a call from Cyrus Academy stating that Jamil had been expelled. The woman demanded an explanation from Jamil right now. After the dwarf boy was taken away, Prince Curtis approached Arthur and apologized for his behavior. The young prince felt guilty that he was too easily swayed. Arthur bandaged the wound on his hand as he apologized to Prince Curtis. Arthur felt that his emotions had taken over him. Prince Curtis felt that Arthur had the right to do that. From a Trident family or even a Baiken, the prince felt that it would be nice if such students did not exist in Cyrus, because there should be no place for racial discrimination on this continent. After a while, Prince Curtis got into the carriage while complaining about his head hurting so much. But the prince vaguely remembered the feeling when he first met Arthur, the boy he thought was strange. Prince Curtis realized he was talking to himself, because Princess Kathleen didn't respond to his words at all. Suddenly, Princess Kathleen stood up and cleared her throat to give a signal. Arthur, Vincent, and Elijah looked back as they heard the princess signaling to speak. Then, in her soft voice, the princess asked if Arthur would like to have tea with her if there was time later. With a puzzled face, Arthur replied, yes. Princess Kathleen was so excited that she gripped the window. She was looking forward to meeting Arthur at school. Seeing the meaningful look in her eyes, Arthur smiled and bowed his head in fulfillment of her request. Vincent and Elijah were stunned that the notoriously cold princess would take the initiative to ask Arthur to meet again. Princess Kathleen could finally sit in the carriage with a sense of relief now. But she still ignored Prince Curtis, who was frantically shaking the body of his handler because he was in shock. The prince could hardly believe that the one sitting beside him was his cold and stubborn sister. Princess Kathleen was still looking at Arthur's back, who had gone away with the others. At this moment, the princess further realized how different Arthur was from the other children. That day, the town square was very crowded. All the members of Arthur's family and Helste's family, plus Elijah, enthusiastically joined in among the bustling people in the town square. Ellie was astonished to see Elijah's swollen cheeks. Elijah just smiled and rubbed his cheeks. Arthur looked around, thinking that everyone in the place would soon learn that there was another continent out there. The fact that they were spying on the continent using mana beast camouflage and recording artifacts made Arthur think they would only do that if they were afraid of the people on the continent, and they had evil intentions. Arthur wondered to himself if he had done the right thing in improving his ability to reach the new continent. Arthur began to think about making a preemptive strike if they were enemies. Suddenly, Alice's soft voice snapped Arthur out of his reverie. She asked if there was something wrong that was disturbing Arthur's concentration. Because Arthur looked more confused than usual. Arthur smiled very sweetly as he replied that everything was fine. Alice still looked worried as she said she would keep pretending that Arthur was thinking like any other normal 12-year-old, because that's what she usually did. Alice stated that she would always worry about Arthur, but she would not stop Arthur no matter what he did. Seeing his mother's worried demeanor, Arthur gripped his own wrist tightly while wishing in his heart that he could promise not to worry Alice. But Arthur couldn't lie to her like that. Arthur could only smile sincerely while thanking his mother for her concern. The event began with the appearance of two witches on the royal balcony flying 4 special patterns that were able to create holograms in front of everyone. To begin with, King Blaine greeted the elves and the dwarves with peace. Most people in that place probably knew him as the King of Supine, but today he was not speaking as a human king, but as a representative of the continent of Dicketon. King Blaine stood with the kings and queens of the 3 kingdoms of their continent, all gathered on that historic day. This day marked the beginning of the era of the new continent they called home. King Blaine was sure many of them were aware of the hatred between humans and elves, while the dwarves could be considered business partners, but they did not expect it to continue. The leaders of the 3 kingdoms had met repeatedly over the years in an attempt to unite the races. 2 years ago, they had agreed for the members of the 3 races to become an adventure together. It made the king smile with pleasure to see a party of humans, elves, and dwarves working together for a cause. Last year marked another milestone. Cyrus Academy accepted students from the Eleanor Kingdom and the Dwarf Kingdom. Now, the younger generation of wizards could make friends and memories without any barriers. All the leaders understood how difficult it was to adjust after constant hostility. They, however, wanted everyone to let go of the past and any discrimination that might have occurred. If not for themselves, then for the children and the future of the Dicketon continent. Everyone cheered and applauded King Blaine's wonderful speech. Next, King Aldian, the king of the elves, stood up and was honored to be able to speak in front of everyone gathered on this unforgettable day. King Aldian strongly agreed with King Blaine's eloquent message about the future of their continent. But even though they already had a clear vision of the future, King Aldian wholeheartedly said that this continent was filled with many unknowns. There were many dangerous places in the Americas that no one dared to explore. But what if the king told everyone that there was something even more mysterious and dangerous out there? King Aldian warned that they had not heard wrong. Today the kingdom formally announced that they had found evidence of another continent out there. Everyone began to panic, wondering about each other. Arthur knew that this news would not be received well, but what was happening right now was chaos. People started to panic and were very boisterous. King Aldian asked them to calm down because they all didn't know much, so the kingdom was still curious about many things. All the kingdom knew was that there was another continent out there full of adventurous mysteries and possible dangers. There was even evidence that they were trying to reach the Dicketon continent and spy on them. But with current technology, it didn't seem possible for either side to explore that far. The Dwarf King stood up and asked everyone to be quiet with his booming voice. Everyone immediately shut up. Then the king explained that they did not know much about this matter. But in this uncertainty, the 3 kingdoms agreed that standing side by side with each other was best for the continent and the people. So they would not fight each other. Although their appearances were different, even their cultures collided with each other. But from this day on, they all had to remember that they were born on the continent of Dicketon. The Dwarf King was one of the people who was proud of it, and he hoped that future generations would also feel the same way. So he asked, "What does everyone think?" They looked at each other before finally giving a very loud applause for the 2 kings. The Dwarf King explained, "The process of bringing the 3 races of the 3 kingdoms together will take time and a lot of effort. But today they will showcase 6 individuals. They are the individuals that the royal family believed to be the bravest, wisest, smartest, and strongest from each country. They will represent the 3 races of the continent. The dwarf king cleared the 6 people in all white clothes to enter and stand with them. This king explained, the original purpose of these 6 individuals was to defend and maintain the well-being of Dicatan. They will work with the rulers of the continent to ensure that their homeland is protected as they are about to enter a new era that is exciting for everyone. These people will henceforth be known as the 6 lances, which means 6 spears. Each lance symbolizes the bond that they all hold, not only with their own kingdoms, but with the entire continent. The 6 of them bowed before the kings as King Blaine took the gold-colored velvet box containing the 6 rings. The 6 people dressed all in white walked towards the kings. One by one, the 6 of them stood before the dwarf king. The woman was Elia Triskin. Then next was Veray Ori, Ulfred Warrand, Aya Griffin. Then there was Micah Earthborn, and the last was Baron Wykes. The blond youth looked very cold. Elijah was surprised to hear the Wykes clan. It was the same clan as Lucas. In front of everyone, King Blaine asked if the 6 lances were willing to protect and carry the honor of the 3 kingdoms. And to all the aspiring wizards out there, are they willing to become 6 lances in the future? Who would not even be limited by the heavens? 6 Lance stood tall on the stage as he saluted everyone. As everyone clapped for them with happiness, only Arthur stood staring with anger and hatred at Baron Wykes. The day of the announcement had been a cold reminder of reality for Arthur. Lucas Wykes, whose insubordination and betrayal led to the deaths of most of their party, is using his family's power and connections to escape his guilt. Arthur had been warned that taking revenge on Lucas would be suicidal, as he had a dangerous brother, Varen. He was not only a powerful wizard, and now he was also a lance. In addition to Arthur's complicated plans, he also had other more pressing matters to deal with. That day, Arthur even wore clothes that were not his taste at all. But he had to use it because it was Ellie's birthday. Arthur was ready to go downstairs when Sylvie suddenly jumped onto him. Arthur lifted Sylvie's small body and asked her to stay indoors all night. Of course, Sylvie looked sad to be banned from the party. Arthur tried to explain. Mr. Vincent warned him that maybe some guests were attending Ellie's party just to keep an eye on Arthur, so he didn't want to give her any chances. But Sylvie needn't worry, because Arthur would come back and bring lots of food for the beast. Sylvie smiled happily. She asked if Arthur would promise to bring more food. Arthur pinched both of Sylvie's cheeks and replied that he did. Afterwards, Arthur went downstairs to greet the guests at the main door. The noble family was very impressed with Arthur's good looks. The mother of the noble girl even asked her daughter not to forget to ask Arthur to dance. Meanwhile, on the other side of the room, Elijah was trying to get close to a noble girl. With great pride, the boy revealed that he would soon be entering Cyrus Academy. But because he shook the drink in his hand too hard, it spilled on his shirt. Elijah's face immediately turned pale. The girl immediately walked away with an awkward smile, while Elijah looked at Arthur with an angry face, because Arthur turned his face away from him and acted as if they didn't know. Ray came down from upstairs with a happy smile as he told everyone that Ellie had arrived. Everyone flocked to take up positions to greet the star of the show. Ellie came down the stairs with her eyes closed, held by her mother. Ellie thought they were just having a family party. Ellie had complained that she had to wear a pretty dress that felt uncomfortable. Few steps later, Alice opened Ellie's eyes, so everyone wished the girl a very happy birthday. The event that day was very lively. Lots of magic shows, musical performances, and lots of happy guests. But suddenly, Ray knocked on the glass and begged for everyone's attention. With his loud voice, Ray wanted to thank everyone who had come to his precious daughter's birthday party. Ray felt that he had been blessed with many things in life, but now there would be even greater happiness because his dear son and daughter would be taking part in the first dance. Everyone applauded loudly at Ray's announcement, but Ellie's face instantly turned ghastly pale. Tabitha whispered to Alice as she said she didn't know Ellie and Art would be dancing. Tabitha wondered if they had learned about it. With a stiff face, Alice replied that she hadn't. In her heart, Alice wanted to kill Ray for making a surprise that trapped her son like this. Ellie complained to her mom. She doesn't know what to do because she can't really dance. Arthur approaches Ellie with one hand outstretched, begging her to give him the honor of dancing with her. Ellie looks very hesitant, but Arthur smiles confidently and nods his head, as if asking Ellie to trust him. When he saw that both of his children were ready, Ray asked for the music to start. In no time, the music fills the room. Arthur pulled Ellie's body, and they began to dance, albeit slowly. Ellie kept looking at her brother's handsome face, so she began to find confidence and started dancing with a carefree feeling. Tabitha was mesmerized by their moves even though Alice said they hadn't practiced. As a mother, Alice was also mesmerized by their dance moves. She was gaping because she knew they had never practiced dancing before. They moved to the beat of the music. Occasionally Arthur would twist Ellie's body, and she would laugh happily, because he knew that his brother would always be there when Ellie needed someone to hold her hand. For a while, they enjoyed this dance with joy, until finally, Arthur flew Ellie with wind magic, then landed the girl's body carefully. The ending was mesmerizing, and made Ellie truly the star of the party. Everyone was mesmerized by their performance and applauded loudly. Ellie herself didn't expect her brother to be able to surprise her like this. As Ellie looked at him with a questioning face, Arthur just turned one eye with a meaningful smile. Arthur felt happy that the dance lessons from his past life were still useful. When Ellie went to meet their parents, Mr. Gideon approached Arthur and complimented him on his pretty good dance performance. Now, Mr. Gideon wanted to talk to him. Outside the house, a carriage was already taking the guest away early from the party. The servant asked if it was okay for them to leave immediately after leaving a gift for Arthur's sister, because he knew that the princess was quite close to Arthur. The beautiful princess with white hair replied that Arthur's attention should be on his sister today. After all, they would be meeting at school soon. Apparently, this is Tessia, who is now more mature than a few years ago. Arthur walked through the garden with wine in his hand. He completely ignored the admiring glances of the people around him. Mr. Gideon thought Arthur was performing in a one-man play or something. Arthur ignored the old man's scolding. Instead, Arthur said that he didn't expect Mr. Gideon to deliberately sneak into his sister's birthday party just to talk to him. Mr. Gideon was annoyed to hear Arthur's words with an exasperated tone. He said at least he came to the place with a gift. Arthur turned to him when he asked, for what kind of fun did Arthur have to owe a visit from the known artificer in Dickaton? Mr. Gideon was getting annoyed at the sarcasm of Arthur's words. Mr. Gideon only wanted to tell Arthur that the council had approved his blueprint design and was now working on it. Arthur knew that the council referred to the kings and queens of Dickaton, art from the monarchy they had over the three kingdoms. Arthur congratulated Mr. Gideon as he was sure Gideon would get a very good reward for it. Gideon replied that money, fame, or power were all just means to an end. What he wanted was something that even the council could not provide. Before Gideon finished speaking, some teenage boys came up to declare that they were big fans of Mr. Gideon, and they had heard about the big ship he had built. Gideon was quite busy right now, so he asked Arthur not to go anywhere as he would attend to the boys first. Seeing Gideon's attitude, Arthur thought that fame is not only a means to an end, but also has a price. Arthur stood on the balcony and watched as the guests began to leave in their carriages. Just as he was about to enjoy the wine in his hand, a girl's soft voice suddenly called out to him. It turned out to be Lilia, who came towards him while running. With the warmest breath from here, apologizing for not greeting Arthur sooner, Lilia explained that she was late to the party and deliberately wanted to congratulate Ellie first. Arthur explained that it didn't matter, because Lilia's parents had told him how busy the girl was as a secretary in the student council. Arthur asked the girl to put the matter aside and stated that he was happy to see Lilia after a long time. Arthur's sweet smile made Lilia happy and mesmerized. She wondered if Arthur had always been much taller than Lilia all this time. The two of them talked for some time. Lilia told him what had happened to her during this time, and occasionally they would laugh together like brothers who met again after a long time. Arthur saw that the girl who used to hide from her parents and eat with the servants had now grown up. Lilia was embarrassed, but she complained that she had shown Arthur her precious hiding place, but Arthur still made a joke out of it. Arthur replied, because it was hard not to remember how stressed Lilia was about the future. Now she was doing well at the most prestigious wizard academy in Dickaton. And of all the boys who gave the girl soulful looks throughout Mary's conversation, Arthur was sure Lilia was quite popular there. Arthur realized that there were two teenagers who had been watching them on the other side of the room. Lilia became even more embarrassed and panicked. She nervously explained that she didn't have a boyfriend or anything like that. Moreover, everything that had changed in her life was because of Arthur. Lilia looked embarrassed while admitting this, as if she was about to reveal her feelings. Arthur tried to act ignorant and said that he would be more selective about any man Lilia would bring back home. Arthur would be no easier to get to agree with than Uncle Vincent. Here Arthur was trying to act as a good brother or sister to Lilia. The girl was dumbfounded. She was silent for a moment before smiling bitterly and answering, of course. Mr. Gideon approached them and asked permission to borrow Arthur from Lilia. Upon seeing Mr. Gideon, Lilia immediately bowed with great respect. She then said goodbye to Arthur, but that she would see him again later. As Lilia left, Mr. Gideon boasted to Arthur that many people knew him. Arthur asked the old man to be more humble. Mr. Gideon suspects that Arthur is quite popular with the girls. He even suspected that Lilia had a crush on Arthur. While drinking the wine in his hand, Arthur explained that he already knew that. Mr. Gideon saw that the two of them interacted very well, so he wanted to know, did Arthur have any plans to get in touch with the girl? Arthur explained that Lilia was one of the people whose life had changed for the better because of Arthur. So Arthur was sure that the girl's feelings for him were neither like nor love, but something closer to gratitude. Maybe she didn't know it now, but in the future, she would definitely be able to tell the difference. That what she was feeling now was the infatuation a girl might have for a hero. That was all. Mr. Gideon was of the opinion that Arthur's maturity in some ways sometimes made him very sick. Arthur changed the subject. He was sure that Gideon's arrival at the place was not to give him love advice, so set about asking what Mr. Gideon wanted to talk about. Mr. Gideon explained once again that he wanted to use the money, fame and power that the council had given him to get something that I couldn't get from anywhere, namely, the knowledge that Arthur possessed. Arthur paused, before finally explaining that he had thought about this twice after giving Mr. Gideon the blueprints of the steam engine. He didn't want to change the way the world worked any more than he already had. Because the continent was fine without Arthur's previous interference, Mr. Gideon didn't listen to Arthur at all. Instead, he argued that Arthur still had many ideas for inventions that could change the world. Gideon was happy with this fact, while Arthur had a sour face because Gideon's ears only picked up whatever he wanted to hear. So Arthur was forced to raise his dark, murderous aura, address Mr. Gideon respectfully, and make it clear that he would not indulge Mr. Gideon with his curiosity. After being threatened like that, Mr. Gideon finally gave in and said that the words that came out of his mouth were accidental. Mr. Gideon didn't give up, though. He suggested the option of give and take. Mr. Gideon would not ask for a world-changing invention, but he would borrow Arthur's brain from time to time. In return, Mr. Gideon would become Arthur's personal advocate for any artifacts or items he wanted. Again, Mr. Gideon asked if Arthur would agree to this offer. Finally, Arthur agreed and shook the man's hand in agreement. That night the whole family, In fact, all the Helsteins helped Ellie open the gifts. Alice opened one of the gifts containing clothes that she thought were very pretty. Ellie was surprised that she was getting clothes again. She was almost upset about this. Arthur sees a fairly large gift box on the floor. He thought this one looked different, and it might not be clothes anymore. Ellie couldn't wait to open the gift box. The box was so mysterious that there wasn't even a name of the sender. But they found a letter with the box. The letter stated that the sender knew Eleanor or Ellie was getting fed up with countless clothes and tea sets. So the sender deliberately gave this gift in the hope that Ellie would no longer just look at her brother, but make steps to pursue him. And just maybe one day Ellie could become someone strong and able to stand by Arthur's side. Ellie exclaimed in delight as she found a set of bows and arrows in the box. According to Lilia, the bow looked very nice. Meanwhile, according to Mr. Vincent, the bow looked like a creation of the elf clan. Ree wondered who had sent the gift. Meanwhile, Arthur had guessed someone's name to keep to himself. Suddenly, Ellie turned very polite and put on a sweet face when asking for a gift from Arthur. Ellie even calls Arthur her dear brother to get what she wants. Alice had to pinch her daughter's cheeks because of the extreme change in her attitude. Arthur laughed at their behavior. Then he used a little magic to bring out 2 velvet boxes in front of Ellie and Alice. Ellie's face lit up when she saw the boxes. She asked what was in it. It turned out to be the phoenix necklace given to her by Mr. Gideon that time. Arthur explained that the necklace would protect them if he or his father were not around. Tabitha thought it was very pretty. She wondered where Arthur had gotten it. Vincent shook his head as he explained to his wife that he would have to disappoint Tabitha, as there were only 2 necklaces in the world. In particular, Arthur put the necklace around Ellie's neck. He wished his sweet sister a happy birthday. That day in Mr. Gideon's special artifact-making workshop, everyone seemed to be very busy building something. Arthur walked into the place with Mr. Gideon. Actually, he didn't need to bring Arthur into the place. Mr. Gideon was sure Arthur was already aware that no one outside of the employees and council were allowed in the facility. Of course, Arthur already knew that because Mr. Gideon had told him that 8 times. Arthur was really grateful and impressed to be allowed into the place. But Mr. Gideon was curious why Arthur said that with a sour face. Mr. Gideon just looked at an unappreciative boy, as if the word bored was right on his forehead. They chatted while drinking from a special device that looked like a small water tank. Arthur explained that it was hard for him to appreciate this when Mr. Gideon was bothering him for every little step of the project. Mr. Gideon made calls to Arthur around the clock. Because of this, there were a lot of communication rolls flying around. Mr. Gideon realized all those midnight calls were not bringing them closer together. Arthur asked the old man to make friends with people his own age. Mr. Gideon heard that Arthur's birthday had passed not too long ago, but it was 4 months ago. Arthur said it had been forgotten because of his sister's birthday. Mr. Gideon also thought that Ellie's birthday was quite lavish. He asked if Arthur's party was the same. The young man replied no because he only asked for a small party with his family. The arrival of so many socialite butterflies at Ellie's birthday party surprised Mr. Gideon. But anyway, he took a box from his pants pocket and gave it to Arthur as a birthday present even though it was a little late. Arthur received the box with a suspicious look on his face. He asked what was in the box as it wasn't even wrapped. Mr. Gideon was a little annoyed that Arthur was making such a big deal out of a small thing. It was our Lord who wanted to snatch the gift again. So Arthur burst out laughing while saying that it was just a joke. Arthur put down the glass to open the little box. Arthur thanked Mr. Gideon for taking the trouble to make it for him. Mr. Gideon replied that, compared to Arthur's help with the steam engine, this was nothing. But Mr. Gideon was curious why Arthur would want something that had the ability to hide not 1, but 2 elemental attributes. Mr. Gideon laughed as he stated that Arthur was actually a wizard with an elemental quadri or something. Arthur casually said that he was indeed a quadri-elemental wizard. The boy's remark succeeded in making Mr. Gideon spit out the water he was about to drink on the employee, who needed to pass in front of him. Mr. Gideon looked at Arthur with a serious face as he asked if the boy was not joking. But then the old man realized that Arthur wanted the bracelet to hide his attributes, so why did he say that to Mr. Gideon? Smiling sweetly, Arthur said the more Mr. Gideon knew how special he was, the more free stuff he would get, like the bracelet. Mr. Gideon smiled at the crazy boy's ingenuity. He didn't expect Arthur to say such world-shattering news so casually. Actually, Mr. Gideon wanted proof. Arthur said that he would be happy to show his abilities one day. Arthur was impressed about how quickly the ship was built. The old man at his side smiled with satisfaction, as Arthur's first day of school was a happy one, which meant that in just a few days the ship would be ready to sail. Now in front of them stood a wooden ship with a huge steam engine on top. The amazing design of the ship was almost complete. It seemed to be true what Mr. Gideon said. Soon the ship would be ready to sail. Arthur walked home alone. He realized Mr. Gideon really worked very quickly. He was able to set up the steam engine in just a matter of months. If the new continent was the enemy, then Arthur must not train half-heartedly. With the artifact that Gideon gave him, Arthur must try and make the wind and earth comparable to the fire and water elements in him. Arthur was thinking so seriously that he didn't realize he bumped into a big man in front of him. Arthur apologized, but the man still scolded him and swore at Arthur. Seeing the man's insolent attitude made Arthur look at him with a lazy face. The young man was inherent because he often met low people like this. This man arrogantly said if he let go of the undisciplined brat, then that meant he would be a very bad professor. The man even accused Arthur's parents of raising him in a bad way. So the man would go ahead and teach Arthur some life lessons. The man unties Arthur's hair as he states the first lesson is that a real man has short hair and muscles like himself. He removes Arthur's hair tie while explaining the second lesson is that when a boy like Arthur apologizes to someone like him, he should do it on his knees. The man deliberately coated his arm with manna while using his arm to press Arthur's head so that the young man would kowtow to him. But of course Arthur's head did not move at all. The man was astonished that he couldn't get Arthur to bow. In a cold voice, Arthur explained that since the man was drunk, Arthur was willing to allow this, but he advised the man to remove his hands from Arthur. The sharp eyes of Arthur succeeded in making the man very surprised and removed his arm. Even so, he still stared angrily at Arthur. The man asked out loud, how dare Arthur behave and talk like that to Academy Professor Cyrus? Arthur immediately stopped walking when he heard the man's words. It made the man smile with satisfaction to realize that Arthur was no stranger to magic. But if Arthur was one of those Academy students and he saw him, he advised Arthur to hide, because there he could beat up an undisciplined person like Arthur. Arthur casually tied his hair again, while tossing the man's pendant. Then, smiling mockingly at the man, Arthur said he was looking forward to it. The two girls at the man's side were surprised to see the big man's pendant fall from Arthur's hand. They thought there was no way anyone could move that fast to get the pendant. The big man also wondered when the boy had taken the pendant from his neck. That afternoon when he got home, just as Arthur opened the door, Ellie and Sylvie jumped at him together. This time Arthur was ready and blocked their bodies with his wind magic. Arthur smiled sweetly as he told them he was home. Ellie and Sylvie were angry while making pouty faces because Arthur was being unfair and not letting them hug him. Arthur ignores their anger as he asks where Mom and Dad are. Ellie smiled widely as she said, "They're in the living room with Elijah. They got the package from the Cyrus Academy." Ellie immediately pulled Arthur's arm to head to the living room. Everyone was very excited. Elijah showed Arthur a box and asked him to check because it was their school uniform. Alice gave the uniform package to Arthur. The words "Welcome to Cyrus Academy" were beautifully written on the box in gold ink. Arthur looked at the box in his hand with a smile. he thought, from an orphan, to a king, to a baby. Then he has become an adventurer. It seemed like soon he would finally become a student. It wasn't just the two of them who got the uniform box. It turned out that Lucas and Kathleen's daughter also got the box of uniforms. Elsewhere in her room, Tessia looked at her childhood photo with Arthur and smiled. The same with Arthur, who smiles hopefully at the uniform box. Arthur wondered how much more the world could teach him. He seemed to be looking forward to new things. That morning, Elijah tried hard to wake Arthur, who was still comfortably closed. Elijah tried to pull Arthur's leg, because after all they couldn't be late on the first day of school. Suddenly, Sylvie opened her eyes and immediately became angry with the young man with glasses. Sylvie beat him up until Elijah screamed several times because Sylvie's attack was too hard and painful. While they were fighting, Arthur was busy covering his ears. Moments later, Arthur finally woke up with a messed up face. Stretching and walking towards the bathroom, Arthur explained that he would be ready in 5 minutes. Meanwhile, Elijah's face is a mess because of Sylvie's attitude. Even now, Sylvie is still busy biting Elijah's ear. After Arthur came out of the bathroom and was getting dressed, Elijah said that he still couldn't believe that Arthur would be attending the Cyrus Academy as a wizard. Arthur asked Elijah why he didn't believe him, and why not. Arthur had said that he wanted to learn magic theory. Elijah knew that, but Arthur could have learned it in an elective subject, instead of spending his entire life at the academy on it. Arthur explained that fighting with kids his own age didn't interest him at all. Besides, he was still going to take a wizard combat class. Elijah was still worried though because he heard that scholar mage students tended to be looked down upon by battle mage students. Arthur smiled seductively when he realized Elijah was worried about him. Elijah wondered why Arthur could think like that, because he was actually worried about all the students Arthur was going to send to the medical room, because they dared to disturb Arthur. Arthur laughed awkwardly at Elijah's remark. While wearing his school uniform, Arthur asked Elijah not to worry, because Arthur would try to be nice there. Now Arthur was wearing the entire school uniform, which made him look even more dashing and handsome. When they entered the dining room for breakfast, Ray asked them to eat immediately. When Arthur sits down, Ellie complains she thinks it's unfair because she also wants to go to the academy with Arthur. The Kaka asks Ellie to stop playing around in her training if she wants to enter the academy soon. Meanwhile, Elijah asks Alice for help to treat the scratches on his face caused by Sylvie. Elijah deliberately put on a cute face so that Alice would help him. Alice smiled at Elijah's face. She asked gently, "What did Sylvie do to Elijah's face?" Then she happily helps Elijah. Here Ray still can't believe that his son will be attending the famous Cyrus Academy. Ray feels they have managed to raise Arthur well. Ray asks Alice's opinion about this. Alice refuses to agree with Ray's words because she is the only person who raised them. Ray suspected that the only time she took care of them was when they got into trouble. Alice smiled happily as her husband realized that. After breakfast, they take Arthur to the train. Before getting on the train, Arthur said that he would come home when he had time. Arthur rubbed his sister's head as he asked Ellie to be good and look after their parents. As they step onto the train, Arthur reminds them to always wear the phoenix necklace he gave them. Alice and Ellie wave as they hold up their necklaces. Ray asks if there is no last message for him. Arthur prepares to get into the train as he asks his father not to burn down the house while he is training. Ray becomes increasingly annoyed with Arthur, while Alice and Ellie nod their heads in agreement with Arthur's words. After a while, they finally arrived at the gate of Cyrus Academy. Many students entered the gate. Here there were those who carried pet beasts similar to large ancient birds that could be ridden. There were even those who rode badly on a giant old brother, or showed off their magic wands. A senior student asked the juniors to form a line in front of the white central building in front of them as they were all required to attend the admission ceremony. The juniors obeyed. They entered in a very neat line into the white building. Although it looked old-fashioned from the outside, the inside of the building was luxurious and spacious. The junior students had to march to the reception desk to confirm their personal details. After standing in front of the witch and the crystal ball, they would instantly know the identity of the new student currently standing before them. Elijah came in as a candidate for Battle Mage with an Earth magic affinity. Next was Arthur. At first, the magician in front of Arthur read his data casually, but when he realized Arthur had an affinity for Earth magic and Wind magic, the magician was shocked. Arthur pretended not to know and looked worried about that fact. Elijah immediately punched him lightly on the shoulder as he explained that the witch examining them was surprised that Arthur was a dual elemental wizard. The sorceress before them smiled awkwardly and invited them to go inside immediately. The moment they went inside, Elijah immediately put on an amazed face. He didn't expect the place to be so crowded. The neatly lined seats also looked luxurious. No wonder Elijah was amazed by the place. Compared to the main hall, it was even more luxurious. Elijah chose a seat quite at the end as long as he could get a seat with Arthur. He had to pass several students. Elijah politely asked for permission to pass. He also greeted several students who wore the same uniform as him, but they just regarded Elijah as another weak magic nerd. Arthur didn't accept the way they mocked Elijah, so he looked at them with a murderous aura as he passed. The pressure from Arthur made them panic, and soon allowed him to pass politely. Arthur sat pensively with his chin propped up. He had forgotten how tough kids this age could be with their peers. Suddenly, Wind Magic appeared as the director of Cyrus Academy. Mistress Cynthia entered the tradition. The old woman blinked at Arthur before snapping her fingers as she created sound magic on all the students. Suddenly, all the students lost their voices. Arthur was amazed by this magic. Arthur did know that Madame Cynthia could use sound magic, but he didn't know it could cover the entire building. Madame Cynthia smiled and apologized for her rudeness, but she didn't like talking loudly. It wasn't good for her throat, especially at this age. Madame Cynthia wanted to humbly welcome all of them, future leaders, scholars, and the source of Dicaton's power, to the Academy. Then she introduced herself as the director of the Academy. While she was considering giving a long and rather boring speech, Madame Cynthia realized this year was very special. Madame Cynthia proudly said, since the institution was founded, they had never been attended by so many elves and dwarves as today. All the students clapped their hands with happy smiles at Madame Cynthia's words. Then she continued, therefore, there was no one better to welcome them all than the students who would help in leading and casting their votes towards them all. Madame Cynthia asked them to give a warm welcome to the Cyrus Academy Student Council members. Several students in special white uniforms entered the stage. They all looked cheerful as they greeted the juniors while waving their hands. Elijah got excited when he saw Lilia among the Academy Council. He asked Arthur to get excited for Lilia too. At the end of the council's lineup, a beautiful fairy-like girl with beautiful, shiny white hair appeared. All the students were stunned to see such a charming figure. Elijah was also curious as to who this beautiful girl was. Sylvie, who was originally sleepy, immediately turned excited when she saw the charming figure who was now the center of attention. Arthur also smiled meaningfully at the figure. In his heart, Arthur greeted the figure who was none other than Tessia. The male students started talking about Tessia, the beautiful daughter of Aerolith. Some had heard that she had been at the academy since last year as a direct student of the Goodsky director. Tessia was considered a talent because she could be a direct student of Madame Cynthia, who was notorious for not accepting students. They were busy talking about Tessia's beauty. However, they also heard that Tessia was very cold and strict. But some of the youths didn't care about that. They wondered what they should do to get Tessia to look at them. It was only natural that the boys were very interested in Tessia, because now she had grown into a very beautiful, graceful, and famously intelligent teenage girl. In fact, Tessia was standing in the center of the main podium giving a speech as the president of the council right now. Tessia greeted all the students and introduced herself as the student council president. To begin with, she congratulated them all for making it into the best magical institution on the continent. Although Tessia was still in grade 1 just like all of them, but she had the privilege of observing the academy for a year longer. Aside from the lessons and bonds formed within this platform, Tessia also saw the discrimination that scholar mages specifically had. If the difference in uniforms could make a difference between them, Tessia was worried about what would happen due to racial differences. Today, Tessia stood before all of them new generation students and begged them to get rid of the old generation's mindset that gave birth to animosity between the various races. Just as the royal family had come together to form a student council, they should also do the same for the future of this continent. Everyone in the room cheered and gave a huge round of applause for Tessia's amazing speech. Arthur did not miss out on giving the same response. Sylvie was also excited. She called Tessia Mama and asked Arthur to go say hello to her. Arthur held the little creature back, asking himself why Tessia was chosen as Mama. But Sylvie ignored the question and continued to cheer cheerfully while calling Tessia Mama telepathically. Suddenly, Elijah called Arthur and said that he seemed to be in love. The bespectacled young man's face lit up as he settled on Tessia, but that remark earned him a sharp, dark stare from Arthur and Sylvie. He was shocked to get such letter stares. This was because he had talked about being in love 4 times on the way to the building. Elijah tells Arthur to shut up because he thinks this is very different. Arthur looks at Tessia and thinks that she has changed a bit. Elijah pushes Arthur and gives him a serious look when he asks how Arthur knows that Tessia has changed a bit. He suspects that Arthur knows her too, just as he suddenly recognized Princess Kathleen and Prince Curtis. Elijah suspected that Arthur's invitations to beautiful girls were mixed up in the mailbox. Arthur pushed his friend's body away, but he was still open to the figure of Tessia. Finally, the welcoming party was over, and they were allowed to leave the building. Elijah complained that he knew they were all discussing important things in there, but it was so boring for him. Elijah looked at Arthur and realized that he was getting attention from everyone, but Arthur didn't seem to notice or even care about other people's judgment. Elijah really regretted that. A few meters in front of them was a human shouting at the dwarf disciple. The young man did not think that a dwarf of short stature like the person in front of him could hope to become a true augmenter. He told the dwarf to just forge weapons for a true warrior like himself. The young dwarf was not to be outdone. In a high voice he asked who the young man before him was. Who did he think he was to deserve the weapons of the dwarves? Elijah invited Arthur to see what all the commotion was about. Arthur followed him in silence, thinking that blatant racism was setting in. Arthur thought, it looks like Tessia is going to put him in a difficult time. The human youth introduced himself as Nicholas Drale. He challenged the dwarf youth to declare a duel, and accused the short youth of only being able to bark. Not accepting Nicholas' words, the short youth named Brosnin Bor officially declared a duel between himself and Nicholas Drale. The young man held the school symbol on his chest so that it instantly glowed. Similarly, Nicholas casually held the symbol on his chest while saying that he accepted the duel. Suddenly, the light shone between the two of them after activating the symbols on their shirts. Arthur came to realize this artifact distributed by the school can create a barrier around the user for duels that occur within the school. He thought this was very interesting. Nicholas was ready with his sword weapon, while Brosnin took out a large axe. All the students cheered in support of the duel. Elijah was no less excited when he supported Bronze. Arthur closed his eyes briefly to concentrate. When he opened them, he could see the core status of the two people in front of him. Nicholas had a dark red core, while Brosnin was still at the black core level. Arthur couldn't wait to see what they would do. The first to attack was Brosnin. He jumped quite high and then used a spell to coat his weapon. Nicholas smiled mockingly, then advanced while casting a spell. Nicholas drove both of his swords into the ground, creating a spear out of the ground. Elijah was shocked to see the blunt blades. Only Arthur thought Nicholas was able to use such earth as an augmenter when he was just a red core mage. It had shown that he was not only talented, but also received a lot of training. Even so, Brosnin managed to destroy the earthen blade with just one strike. Just as the young dwarf wanted to attack Nicholas directly, suddenly the blond youth was no longer standing where he was, and tried to attack Brosnin from behind. Fortunately, Brosnin turned his head in time and managed to parry Nicholas' attack. Nicholas' body was thrown a few meters, but he twisted his body until he managed to get back to his feet. Brosnin didn't want to waste any time and immediately attacked while Nicholas was still off guard. Nicholas smiled at how aggressive the dwarf youth was. He deliberately swung his sword at the ground to throw dust so as to block Brosnin's view. The dwarf youth was annoyed that Nicholas was fighting like a coward like this. Before he could respond, Nicholas struck Brosnin in the stomach, knocking him to the ground. Now, Nicholas stood over Brosnin's body while saying, "So what if he fought like that? A win is a win." Everyone knew the duel was over since the barrier was destroyed. But Elijah saw that Nicholas didn't seem to plan on stopping. Just as Elijah suspected, Nicholas said he wanted to see what Brosnin's years at the school would be like with a broken arm. Nicholas said this while raising his leg right above Brosnin's arm. It looked like he was planning to crush the dwarf youth's arm. Elijah stepped forward because this was his chance to be a hero. But suddenly Arthur shouted that there was a school council president heading towards them. Arthur's shout made Nicholas immediately stop his actions and look in all directions while storing his weapon. Elijah stares at Arthur with a sharp look in his eyes because he completely ruined Elijah's chance to shine. With an innocent face, Arthur says that it looks like he just saw wrong. Arthur also said that Elijah just wanted to buy back the boy who swung the sword or Nicholas. Before Arthur could finish speaking, his body suddenly faltered as someone pulled him back. It turned out to be Nicholas. He stared at Arthur with an angry look in his eyes. Nicholas was angry that Arthur seemed to be picking a fight with him. He couldn't accept Arthur ruining his unfinished duel. Arthur raised his arms with a smile and asked Nicholas to remain calm. He reminded Nicholas that discriminating was not cool. Besides, Arthur was sure the duel was over long before that because the barrier was inactive. In a high tone, Nicholas said he was the one who would decide when the duel ended. Then he rudely pushed Arthur's body while referring to him as a first-year student who has a skinny, dry body. In this condition, Arthur tried to hold back his anger. He just thought, is that how duels work in this school? Nicholas was preparing to leave when he said he hoped not to see Arthur during class. Sylvie still couldn't accept Nicholas acting like that towards Arthur, so he deliberately spat right into Nicholas' neck. Of course, this made Nicholas very angry. He looked at Arthur with a look of malice in his eyes. But with his innocent smiling face, Arthur pointed at Sylvie, saying it wasn't him who did it, but that little creature. Nicholas was so angry that he was immediately going to use elemental power to attack Arthur, who dared to behave like that to him. But before he could carry out his evil intentions, a woman's soft and firm voice asked if Nicholas dared to do it. All eyes turned in one direction with shocked faces. Arthur followed the direction of their gazes until he saw Tessia coming towards him with two fellow school counselors. After the opening speech for the juniors, Tessia and all the other council members left the building to see what was next on their schedule. But Tessia was still stuck thinking about what she should do the next time she met Arthur. Earlier in the day, she didn't see Arthur at all among the hundreds of students. Tessia wondered if Arthur had missed the opening ceremony. But Master Goodsky said that Arthur was at school. Tessia wondered how she should behave when meeting Arthur. Should she be cool or more friendly? But what if Arthur found her first? Tessia's face was red at the thought of all these possibilities. A repeated call from Clive, her deputy, woke Tessia from her reverie. The young man asked if Tessia was unwell, because she seemed unfocused. Clive suggested canceling another meeting if Tessia was unwell. Tessia raised her hand and explained that she was fine, but there were indeed many things to do today. Suddenly, Tessia heard the voice of a young man speaking in a high tone. It turned out to be Nicholas, who was threatening Arthur and hoping not to meet Arthur in between classes later. Seeing the direction of Tessia's gaze, the deputy explained that the young man who was shouting was Nicholas from the Betrayal family. He was one of the promising students who came last year. And the red-haired boy seemed to be a first year, but Clive didn't recognize him from any noble prospective student party. Clive guessed that the young redhead or Arthur was just a commoner. Lilia just turned her head towards the quarreling youths, just as Nicholas was about to attack Arthur. Lilia and Tessia's faces turned panicked. They were worried that Nicholas would die if he upset Arthur. Tessia immediately instructed Nicholas' behavior with the question, does he dare to start that fight? Nicholas, who panicked at the appearance of the chairman of the board, immediately put away his sword. With a stern face, Tessia approached them. Nicholas pointed a finger at Arthur when he stated that this was just a misunderstanding. Originally, Nicholas had only accepted a duel from a dwarf named Brosnin, but suddenly the first-year student interrupted them. Arthur ignored Nicholas' words and intended to greet Tessia with a sweet smile. But his intention was interrupted by Lilia, who approached him with a worried face. Lilia asked what was really going on. Seeing their closeness, Tessia asked if the two of them knew each other. Lilia confirmed it, because Arthur's father has worked with her father for several years even now, so they've been friends for a long time. But Arthur replied to their conversation by saying that they had been living together until now. Tessia made a confused face at Arthur's ambiguous words. Lilia immediately reprimanded Arthur because the young man's words were a little misleading. But with an innocent face, Arthur said that it was not wrong. Clive asks Nicholas what this is all about. Even though Nicholas is being bullied, it can't be used as an excuse to point a gun at Arthur. Nicholas looks panicked as he explains. He just wants to scare him. He won't hit Arthur. Hearing the class explanation made Clive think of letting him go. But Tessia immediately lit up the young man's conversation. Since Nicholas pointed the gun at someone outside of the duel, so it was a violation of school rules. Even if it was true that Nicholas could stop his weapon before it hit the opponent, but that action alone could get him sanctioned. Even if Nicholas hit his opponent's hair, then expulsion would be the last thing he needed to worry about. Tessia revealed all those horrible facts as she walked closer to Nicholas and looked at him with sharp eyes, making Nicholas shrink. Tessia urged and asked once again if Nicholas would dare to do that. Of course, Nicholas was frightened and immediately apologized to Arthur while admitting that he had acted rashly out of anger. Arthur ignored whatever Nicholas did while pretending not to know. Tessia said Nicholas' actions would be reported, but now he could leave. So could everyone else. Because of Tessia's cold demeanor and angry aura, everyone actually left, except for the council members, Arthur and Elijah. Tessia turned to Arthur with a dizzy face. She asked why Arthur started a fight on his first day of school. Tessia remembered her grandfather telling Arthur to stay humble. Who knows what would have happened if Arthur had beaten up the seniors and caused trouble from the first day of school. Arthur's face turned cold at Tessia's words. He didn't even care when Sylvie tried to jump on him. As a result, it had to be Elijah who caught the little beast. Elijah and Lilia look at each other when they realize Arthur is really angry. Instead of realizing the situation, Clive chased Arthur and grabbed his shoulder while asking in a high-pitched tone if Arthur grew up in a wheat field, because his manners were very poor. Tessia warned her deputy to stop bothering Arthur, but Clive couldn't stop because he found Arthur's behavior unacceptable. He was upset that Arthur would dare to talk to Tessia like that. He was sure Arthur was behaving like that because he hadn't been brought up the right way. Arthur sighed heavily. With a cold voice, he said he didn't like people who held him like that. Before Clive could ask further questions, Arthur had already thrown him very high and then let the young man fall to the ground. All the students who saw the incident were shocked. Lilia approached Clive to ask if he was all right. Arthur moved on without looking back. It was Elijah who apologized to Tessia for what Arthur had done. In his arms, Sylvie was still struggling while waving her small arms because she wanted to get to Tessia. The elven girl was stunned, her face pale. She was in turmoil as she watched Arthur leave in anger. Back in her room, Tessia banged her own head against the wall, saying that everything had gone wrong. Everything was over. Tessia flopped down on the bed, then grabbed a pillow to scream as loud as she could while covering her face. Then she lay down on the bed, but a second later she woke up with an upset face. Tessia talked to herself, asking if this was all her fault. If Arthur really got into trouble like he had a tendency to do, then she would not only lose access to the library but also the training facility privileges. But Tessia felt she shouldn't be so hard on Arthur. Arthur wasn't the one with the gun after all. Tessia began to feel guilty about what she had done to Arthur. But then, Tessia remembered Arthur himself was a weapon. And even worse, how could Arthur live with Lilia? Did he find another girl in the forest to live in their house? Tessia blamed Madame Cynthia for making Tessia the head of the student council. If it wasn't for that, Tessia wouldn't have to treat all the students fairly, so that she could have a reunion with Arthur while putting on a cheerful face and hugging. The fact that she couldn't hug Arthur after all this time made Tessia think that she had experienced something very annoying. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door, and it was Clive who wanted to check on Tessia, because he saw that Tessia looked exhausted during the meeting, and after their meeting with the first-year boy. Tessia replied coldly that she was fine because she wasn't the one who was thrown earlier. Clive was still curious who Arthur was. Why did he dare to talk to Tessia like that when she was trying to give him advice? Clive thought about talking to the director about Arthur's behavior. But Tessia said firmly that the matter was over, so she told the young man to go rest. Tessia flopped onto the bed in a mess. She didn't even bother to open the door for Clive. Tessia was still thinking about Arthur, who was now a handsome young man, but he was still useless. Tessia just realized something and started to worry how many of her classmates would be interested in Arthur later. This thought made the girl angry and shouted even louder until it was heard outside the room and made Clive shiver with fear. Meanwhile, Elijah and Arthur had arrived at their room. They were currently preparing to change their clothes and clean their bodies. Elijah thought that school is really big. He couldn't believe it would take so long to look around. He was also amazed that they prepared blankets for the students. Arthur only mumbled a little in response to Elijah's remark. This led Elijah to believe Arthur was still thinking about the student council representative he had thrown out. Arthur smiled a little as he confirmed his best friend's conjecture. But the truth was that he was also thinking about several things, including Tessia's words. On second thought, Arthur realized that Tessia's words were not wrong. But Arthur was still upset. Arthur patted himself on the head and tried to forget what had happened. There was a knock on the door in their room. When Arthur opened the door, it was Mrs. Cynthia. She greeted Arthur with a friendly smile, asking if he could come in. Arthur opened the door wider in response to Mrs. Cynthia's question. Elijah turned to the door, and he was shocked to see that the figure standing in their doorway was Madame Cynthia. Elijah immediately bowed and stated that he was honored to meet Madame Cynthia in person. Mrs. Cynthia knew Elijah, and she had also heard many great things about Elijah from Vincent. Of course, Elijah smiled at the compliment from someone like Mrs. Cynthia. Elijah saw Mrs. Cynthia looking at Arthur meaningfully, as if they had something to talk about, so Elijah asked permission to go downstairs to get a drink. Madame Cynthia thanked him for his good intentions. As the two of them sat down and faced each other, Madame Cynthia reminded Arthur to call her Cynthia instead, but Arthur had made it clear yesterday that he didn't want to. Mistress Cynthia observed Arthur and realized it wasn't just his little beast that had changed. Mrs. Cynthia saw that the black bracelet Gideon gave her. Now she could only sense the attributes of wind and earth from Arthur's body. She suspected that Arthur had used the talisman to seal his other powers. Arthur showed the black bracelet on his right hand, making Madame Cynthia sigh heavily. Although she couldn't say that she was disappointed, Madame Cynthia still said she wanted to be able to go around and introduce Arthur as her quadra-elemental protégé. On the other hand, she was happy that Arthur had chosen Scholar Mage, as she had expected. Arthur planned to tell Mrs. Cynthia everything when he could meet the director later, but Arthur had made a problematic enemy as an adventurer, so he didn't want to give her a reason to suspect him, at least for now. In response to Arthur's words, Madame Cynthia smiled. She had not expected Arthur to call the Wykes family and the heir of the most influential military family an enemy. She was worried about who Arthur's enemies would be in the future. Arthur wasn't surprised that Madame Cynthia knew about it. He had expected that the guild wouldn't keep this a secret from Madame Cynthia. But what an unpleasant thing to say to a preteen boy who had just started his school life. Mistress Cynthia confirmed it and apologized to Arthur for taking it as a joke. Arthur told her not to worry about it, but speaking of school life, Arthur wanted to ask Mrs. Cynthia for help on another matter. Arthur wanted to take an upper-level mana theory class, specifically on deviance. Mrs. Cynthia didn't think it was difficult, but she thought Arthur's main reason for attending school late was to fit in with his peers. Arthur explained that he would be taking this class above normal with students his own age. Arthur was just a little impatient to learn more about deviant mana manipulation, because he had reached his limit recently. Though in his heart, the reason Arthur wanted to take this class was because there was nothing similar to deviant magic in his old world. Mistress Cynthia is willing to make that happen. She can even give you permission so that Arthur can also observe the mock battles of high-class mages. Arthur was quite surprised by how smoothly this discussion went, so he put on a suspicious face as he asked, "What does Mistress Cynthia want now?" Suddenly Elijah opened the door wide and accused Arthur of being the one who had been rude to Director Goodsky. He was upset that Arthur could misjudge Mrs. Cynthia's kindness as an ulterior motive. Mrs. Cynthia tries to diffuse Elijah's anger by saying that she does have ulterior motives. Madame Cynthia immediately talked about the school council to Arthur as Elijah put the drinks on the table. Mrs. Cynthia explained that the school council could be called the school's patrons. This year, Mrs. Cynthia intended to make a sword, and she wanted Arthur to join the discipline committee. Arthur was confused about what the committee meant. So Madame Cynthia explained. Arthur must have noticed that the academy was filled with young wizards who thought they were the equivalent of gold, and often caused trouble. The disciplinary committee was responsible for enforcing peace and order in the school. Arthur asked with an astonished face, "Isn't that something that a first-year student can't enter?" And Arthur is not a Betrayal mage student. In response to this question, Mrs. Cynthia replied casually that it was her school, so that was the rule. Elijah and Arthur were astonished at this old witch's behavior. Arthur had no interest in theory classes anymore if he had to be on the school council. Arthur would learn from library books only. Mrs. Cynthia explained that the books were not accessible to the lower grades, and for the upper grades, Arthur would have to show that he was a deviant, which was something Arthur could not do now. Mrs. Cynthia laughed contentedly as Arthur made a face of annoyance at the rules she had spoken. Seeing their attitude, Elijah thought that they were old friends, not director and student. Madame Cynthia explained again that the members of the disciplinary committee were chosen based on strength, so Arthur had friends he could spar with regularly and also learn from them. Madame Cynthia would even give Arthur access to private training facilities. Mistress Cynthia's words made Arthur realize something. If the members of this committee were chosen based on strength, then something Arthur feared might happen. But Madame Cynthia had already anticipated it. Madame Cynthia explained that, Despite the Wykes family's insistence on giving Lucas a place, Madam Cynthia had turned them down in the hope that Arthur would join. Arthur made a sour and gloomy face because Madam Cynthia had really prepared everything well in order to recruit Arthur to this committee. But Madam Cynthia refused all that for Arthur's sake. Arthur finally agreed, but he hoped that the training facility was one of the rich places. Madam Cynthia stood up from the chair and waved her hand in the air as she took out the uniform case towards Arthur. As she walked to the door, Mistress Cynthia explained that she had arranged the day off so that Arthur could adjust his disciplinary committee uniform. Elijah bowed in respect as he realized the director was preparing to leave. Unlike Arthur, who was still sitting casually, without ever bowing in such a respectful manner, Arthur stared at the box in his hand with an annoyed face, because Mrs. Cynthia seemed to know that Arthur would not be able to refuse the offer to be on the discipline committee. Before actually leaving Arthur's room, Mrs. Cynthia asked him to fix things with the student council president, Tessia. According to her, it would not be good if Arthur continued to be angry at his childhood friend. Hearing Mrs. Cynthia's explanation made Elijah as still as a stone, ready to crumble. He looked at Arthur with a shocked face, and his mouth gaped wide. Then Elijah screamed out loud as he asked if it was true that Tessia Erlith was Arthur's childhood friend. That night, on the way to the cafeteria, Arthur tried to apologize to Elijah, who kept making a sad face. Arthur actually wanted to say that to Elijah, but suddenly everything became like that. Elijah replied that it didn't matter, but his face was still gloomy. Elijah remembered a childhood friend, a well-built girl named Helgard. Arthur could imagine how horrible that girl's body looked, but in keeping with Elijah's feelings, Arthur said she seemed like a nice little girl. Elijah mentioned the names of the girls Arthur was close to, starting with Lilia, Kathleen's daughter, and now the Tessia's daughter. Elijah suspected that his friend would soon be flirting with the goddesses. Arthur walked ahead of the bespectacled youth as he replied that he had never flirted with anyone. Elijah thought that was even worse. Elijah suspected Arthur was secreting alluring pheromones or something. Elijah clung to Arthur's body as he asked to be given such pheromones as well. Arthur even asked him to stay away because Elijah was very strange that day. Elijah actually said Arthur was just as weird because he could like someone like Elijah. Elijah's words instantly made Arthur walk away as fast as he could with his tray of food. But as he looked around for an empty table, Arthur saw people around the place looking at him with strange eyes. Elijah suspected that the rumors about Arthur had spread. Elijah expected Arthur to be sad, but instead the young redhead smiled happily with a cheerful face because he felt very popular among the students. Elijah thought Arthur was getting weirder and weirder. When Arthur and Elijah finally got their seats for dinner, they enjoyed a peaceful and laughter-filled dinner. Until a young man with some of his gang greeted them. The young man said he couldn't help noticing that Elijah had been wasting his time on people he didn't deserve. The young man introduced himself as Charles Revenportsi, of the famous Revenport family. He was sure Elijah had already heard of his family name. Charles felt he was being very generous that day, so he would let Elijah join his group. He was sure Elijah wouldn't regret this. But Elijah instead referred to the young man by the surname Revenpoop. Arthur couldn't help but laugh at the funny surname. They made Charles' surname into a joke. Arthur thought there was no family name more ridiculous than that. Elijah apologized while holding back his laughter because he seemed to have heard wrong. Charles was furious that his family name was being mocked like that. He threw Arthur and Elijah's tray of food. He couldn't accept his noble family name being mocked like that. Even though Charles had been kind enough to welcome Elijah into his group so that Elijah wouldn't degrade himself by hanging out with the troublemaking scholar trash, Elijah spat at him instead. Elijah stood up as he asked, why did he have to go with someone who denigrated his best friend so blatantly? They were all wizards in this academy, so Elijah advised them not to think of themselves as superior. Charles was shocked to hear Elijah's words. He assumed Elijah was from a cave or something like that because he didn't know the difference between them and a troublemaking boy from an ordinary family like Arthur. Elijah got even angrier, loudly stating that he had indeed lived in a cave. But didn't the student council say that they shouldn't treat others differently? Charles understood that the student council did say that, but it was just for political purposes, because in reality, it was not so. Charles began to raise his fist at Arthur, because he was sure Elijah would realize it if he witnessed the difference in strength firsthand. But before Charles' punch hit Arthur's body, his hand was knocked back very hard. Yet everyone didn't see Arthur move an inch. Charles wondered how Arthur could have attacked him since he didn't even see Arthur move. He thought it was just a coincidence. So this time Charles would use his mana to deliver a bigger blow because he was sure there was no way a scholar boy like Arthur could move that fast. Suddenly, Elijah stood between Arthur and Charles. With a stern face, without any hesitation, Elijah was determined to protect Arthur. In this very short time, Arthur could still think that he could get out of the way by using magic, but Elijah might not. Suddenly, tendrils of plants appeared, and lightning fast held Charles' hands and body until he was suspended in the air. As a result, Charles could not hit them,